Hi, my name is Enrica Troiano. I am a PhD student at the Institute for Natural Language Processing, University of Stuttgart, and I am supervised by Roman Klinger, Sebastian Pado, and Kai Sassenberg, who works at the University of Tübingen. In my PhD project, I apply methods from computational linguistics to investigate a topic that has been thoroughly studied in psychology, which is emotions. I want to understand the relationship between emotions and arguments, specifically those arguments that people write on blogs, on social networks, and all these types of digital environments where there is a written exchange of ideas. Arguments serve to persuade people. When we want to prove our ideas right, we provide evidence which argues in favor of our perspective. This evidence, which can be facts or logical reasons, may convince others to change their mind on the discussed topic. Other than evidence, however, also emotions may be a key ingredient to persuasion, in the sense that the success of our arguments may depend on the emotion we express. For instance, sometimes a text that conveys joy is more convincing compared to a neutral, unemotional text. And a text full of anger may be more effective compared to one evoking sadness. So, to understand the role that emotions play in the persuasive power of arguments, I am tapping on methods for the automatic processing of language. And I am implementing a system that first identifies the emotion expressed in a text and then rewrites the text such that it expresses a new emotion. Eventually, this will allow me to observe if a change in the emotion connotation of the text also affects its persuasive power. So let's take a closer look at the problem of changing emotions in texts. This task is conceptually similar to modifying the style of an image. So in computer vision, the idea is to take the content of a picture, say a cat, and to combine it with a specific style of visual representation, like the painting style of Van Gogh. The result of this combination will be a Van Gogh-styled cat. So it is an image which has the same semantic content of the input, but it has a different aesthetics. Similarly, we can combine content and emotion styles in text. For instance, the angry sentence, "My dumb, careless sister broke a precious vase," and the joyful sentence, "My sister finally broke that old wreck," are two emotional variants of the same semantic content, because they both voice the idea that my sister broke a vase. Now, in these two examples, emotions can be considered to be a style or a mode of presentation of the topic because they are simply evoked by the words dumb, careless, and finally. But in other cases, like in "I am happy today," emotions are not only evoked, but they are directly named. In these cases, changing the emotion connotation of a text may also change its content. So the goal and the challenge really of my PhD project is to find a system that simultaneously achieves these two goals, changing the emotion connotation of a text while keeping its content. The strategy I am using for keeping content is back translation. Back translating means that we translate an input text from one language to another and then back. For instance, we translate from English to German and then from German back to English. If you've ever tried and done this yourself with any technology for automatic translation, you may have noticed that going back to the original language doesn't always return the original input. The main content is still there, but some words may have changed, so what we obtain is actually a paraphrase of the input. For me, this is very convenient because it is a way of rewriting a piece of text. It is a way of leaving the content of an input text unchanged while introducing slight variations to the surface forms. But are these variations significant enough as to change the emotion connotation of the input text? To put it differently, does back translation keep or change emotions? Understanding this property of back translation is essential for me because it helps me understand whether back translation is actually a useful strategy for reaching my ultimate goal. To answer this question, I observed if there is a difference between the paraphrases obtained with back translation and the input texts. Given a bunch of texts, I automatically identified the emotion that they express using an emotion classifier. I then produced back translations, so to find their paraphrases, and then I used again the emotion classifier to see what emotion is in the paraphrases. After that, I measured the difference between the final emotion connotation and the emotion connotation of the input texts. This difference can actually be measured because what an emotion classifier does is assigning a score to emotions, and we can interpret this score as the degree to which the emotion is in the text. The differences between the paraphrases and the original texts are contained in this heat map. Such differences are measured for 7 emotions: anger, disgust, fear, guilt, joy, sadness, and shame. The texts that I use come from a collection of event descriptions where each description is associated with just one of these emotions. However, when I run my emotion classifier on a text, I obtain a numerical score for each of these emotions. This allows me to understand what happens during translation, not only with respect to the predominant emotion that is in a text, but also with respect to all the others that are there to a lower degree. Each row of the heat map shows, on average, what is the difference between the group of descriptions that express the emotion on that row and their back translations. And we know that difference for all of the emotions scored by the classifier, which are on the columns. So for instance, the top left cell tells us that when texts expressing anger are back translated, we lose on average 22% of anger, while the top right cell tells us that in those back translations, we gain a little bit of shame. Similarly, the bottom row, as another example, the bottom row tells us that the back translations of the texts expressing shame have a little bit more anger than their original counterpart. They also have an increase in disgust, fear, guilt, joy, and sadness, but they have a decrease in the emotion that was originally there, shame. So what is striking about this heat map is that the diagonal contains the smallest numbers, and the opposite is true for the off-diagonal area. This basically means that the emotion that is present in an input text gets slightly lost in back translation. It is tuned down while all the others are scaled up. This is a nice finding, but it cannot be generalized as a property of back translation because it may depend on the specific parameters that I used. For instance, it can be an effect of the texts that I used, of the type of emotion classifier I used, the languages I selected for back translation, and the nuts and bolts for generating the translations themselves. So, to eliminate the influence of my specific choices on these results, I conducted the same experiment and I measured the emotion difference between the paraphrases and the input texts with different combinations of parameters. For instance, this is the heat map I obtain using a different collection of texts with different emotions, different languages in the back translation, and different mechanics for emotion classification and translation. These numbers are a bit different compared to what I showed you before. However, we can still see the pattern according to which the original emotion is tuned down and the others are tuned up. To wrap it up, back translation seems to preserve the emotion connotation of text only to an extent, so it has the potential to help me rewrite texts while turning one emotion connotation into another. The question now is, how do I do that concretely? How can I combine the content of texts, which is preserved by back translation, with the specific emotion connotation that I want those texts to have? Well, this question boils down to how to produce back translations which have a specific emotion connotation. A pretty straightforward approach to this problem consists in introducing a slight variation to the previous experiment. Rather than taking one back translation for an input text, we take many. This is possible because tools for automatic translation offer the possibility of finding different translations for one input. By translating each of them back, we then obtain a number of paraphrases for one individual input. We can now take advantage of this multitude of paraphrases in order to combine the content of an input text and a desired emotion. We do so simply by searching among these paraphrases and by selecting the one which expresses the target emotion the most. Again, that's with the help of an emotion classifier. For instance, a sad variant of this input text is the first paraphrase, because this is the saddest text among the back translations, while the second paraphrase would be considered an angry variant of the input text, due to its high score in anger. Given all these paraphrases, which are associated with different target emotions, I can now measure the difference between these paraphrases and their input text, similar to what I did before. These differences are reported in this heat map. Here, the emotions on the rows are those expressed by the input texts, just like before. Instead, the emotions on the columns are those emotions for which the paraphrases were selected. For each group of event descriptions associated to the emotions on the rows, I found paraphrases for each target emotion on the columns. So let's take a look at the bottom row, corresponding to the input texts which express shame. This row tells us that if we take the back translations of those shameful texts, so to say, and if among those back translations we take those that were selected for guilt, on average we have 9% more guilt compared to the input texts. If we take the back translations that were produced for joy, we find 11% more joy compared to the input texts. If we take the back translations produced for fear, we find 11% more fear compared to what we had before, and so on. Also in this heat map, we can observe some type of pattern. Here, the diagonal tends to contain the highest numbers of the matrix. This means that when we look in the space of possible back translations, it's easier to find texts that have a higher degree of the input emotion compared to having a completely different emotion. To say it differently, it's easier to change the emotion connotation of texts such that the original emotion is still there and it increases. It's more difficult to go from one emotion to another. Okay, let's combine the findings of the two experiments into a coherent story. On the one hand, back translating removes the emotions present in a text, because in the individual back translation returned by a system for machine translation, the original emotion is stripped away, at least to an extent. On the other hand, we can explore the space of possible translations and find some which have a specific emotion connotation. That is, the emotion style we want to give to the text. Still, among those paraphrases, we are more likely to find one that enhances the original input emotion, rather than finding one with a completely different emotion connotation. This suggests that it is possible to use back translation to simultaneously preserve content and modify emotions, but there is still room for further exploration. From a technical perspective, it opens the questions whether there is a more effective way of integrating emotion recognition and back translation, and also whether I can leverage methods other than translation in order to change emotion connotations. From a more theoretical perspective, it would be ideal for me to understand if and when emotions can be considered to be a style that can be changed without altering the textual content. As we have seen in the first slides, that is not always possible. From the perspective of evaluation, the question is whether human judges would agree that the back translations I found have a different emotion connotation compared to the input texts. Understanding this would ultimately help me understand whether back translations are useful data for addressing the problem of persuasion. Hopefully, I'll be able to answer some of these questions in our next meeting. Thanks for listening.